Volume 14. Chapter 1301, that's it? Chapter 1301, that's it?
The mortal renegade had fought by Xiaochun using his vile emperor clone, and had faced his water swamp kingdom on that occasion. But at that time, his true form had been asleep, and the clone had been unable to provide detailed feedback about the encounter.
Therefore, this was the mortal renegade's first time encountering the water swamp kingdom in person. He couldn't help but be shaken by the vicious and violent crocodilian turtle, and the terrifying energy fluctuations emanating off of it.
Perhaps if he hadn't seen the ancient historical events playing out around that vortex, it might have been a different story. But he had witnessed with his own eyes how that crocodilian turtle had been dispatched from beyond this starry sky, and had been sent with a specific mission. The mere fact that Bai Xiaochun could summon it was profoundly shocking to the mortal renegade. However, despite understanding the matters of karma involved, he had no time to think over the matter in detail. As soon as the crocodilian turtle lunged toward him, he fell back at top speed, simultaneously sending out another finger of extermination. The crocodilian turtle threw his head back and roared, completely disregarding the finger of extermination as he charged forward aggressively. The finger of extermination was immediately destroyed, and the crocodilian turtle's energy only seemed to be growing more powerful. His howls caused the starry sky to tremble as he bore down on the mortal renegade in completely domineering fashion. The mortal renegade's face fell as he continued to back up, his hands flashing in a double-handed incantation gesture. Instantly, black smoke shot out, forming into a huge face rife with magical symbols, its expression fierce to the extreme. Opening its mouth, it shot toward the crocodilian turtle as if to devour him. However, that was when the crocodilian turtle's eyes shone with mysterious light, and suddenly, he opened his mouth in shocking fashion as well. From a distance, it was obvious that the turtle was simply too big for the face to do anything about him. In fact, in the following moment, the turtle snapped up the face. Then, without pausing for a moment, he continued on toward the mortal renegade. As the starry sky trembled, Bai Xiaochun looked on nervously. Obviously, he understood a lot more about his life essence spirit than the mortal renegade. After all, he had been using the water swamp kingdom from almost the moment he began to practice cultivation. Step by step, his cultivation base had grown higher, until the point where he witnessed the events of ancient history only moments before. That was when he was suddenly inspired to take out his turtle walk and send it out, backed by the power of his sovereign cultivation base. With all of the various elements coming together, his water swamp kingdom completely transformed. Now, the majestic crocodilian turtle shone with golden light, and emanated a ferocious air that surpassed anything from before. He left even Bai Xiaochun feeling a bit jumpy. As for why Bai Xiaochun had been able to summon this mysterious crocodilian turtle from beyond the starry sky, he was already fairly certain of the general details. He had been born on the eternal flower, and thus, could also be considered one of many eternal sons. After the eternal flower captured the crocodilian turtle, he became her companion spirit, and thus, it was only natural that someone with the blood of the eternal immortal domains would be able to summon him, albeit with some difficulty. And clearly, his turtle walk also had something to do with it.
Don't tell me that the final battle is going to be won by my life essence spirit? The thought excited him. After all, if the crocodilian turtle could dispatch the mortal renegade, that would make things a lot easier. As Bai Xiaochun looked on excitedly, the mortal renegade's eyes turned pitch black, and he threw his hands over his head, causing black light to spill out in all directions. At the same time, a vortex appeared on his forehead, within which was a magical sigil. It was a sigil that depicted a battleship. As the magical sigil appeared, the mortal renegade began to speak words in an incomprehensible language, a curse of sorts that caused a boundless, ancient, and corrosive attack to spread out into the space around him. Time seemed to slow, causing Bai Xiaochun's heart to pound. Then, the starry sky beneath the mortal renegade's feet suddenly shattered like a mirror. As it did, an ancient battleship shot out into the open, radiating a shocking aura of death. "You have sought your own death, foul creature!" the mortal renegade shouted. The entire starry sky trembled as a massive,
tempest-like energy spread out, causing even Xiaochun to back up in shock. However, the mortal renegade had truly underestimated the crocodilian turtle. In addition to being fierce, he was also completely voracious, and apparently, didn't usually take the time to think things through. Of course, Xiaochun had experienced that firsthand in the past. As soon as the battleship was out in the open, the crocodilian turtle didn't pause for a moment before taking action. Eyes shining with madness, he opened his huge mouth, completely ignored the deadly energy emanating off of the battleship, and lunged forward. With a snap, he gobbled up both the battleship and the mortal renegade. Despite how much Xiaochun knew about this turtle, his eyes still bulged as wide as if he had just watched a mortal eating a bolt of lightning. "Can you eat anything?" he blurted, shocked. The crocodilian turtle looked very pleased with himself as he threw his head back and roared. Obviously, he felt more than a bit of pride at having swallowed his opponent. Ignoring Xiaochun's shock, he shot back toward the swamp, then sank down inside it, whereupon, the swamp faded away. Xiaochun looked on, flabbergasted. That's it? What about my walk?" He was still of the impression that his life essence spirit was very unreliable. Furthermore, he now felt a distinct sensation that there were explosive and violent fluctuations coming from whatever dimension the water swamp kingdom existed in now. At that point, he didn't waste any time. Hands flashing with a double-handed incantation gesture, he caused the vortex of time to spring up again, and immediately shifted time to return to reality. "The mortal renegade will definitely get out. I can't waste any time." He flashed like lightning into the vortex, vanishing, to reappear, back in reality. Once there, he vanished again, and then reappeared in the location of the former immortal world, where the only thing that remained of it was its ruins. Other than the eternal immortal domains themselves, there was no place among the 1,080,000 worlds of the starry sky where Xiaochun felt more of a sense of belonging than here. It was the chi flow of this place that had propelled him from being a celestial into being an Archean. As soon as he appeared in the ruins of the immortal world, he immediately got to work. For one thing, he sent out his divine sense to personally light up the ruins of the immortal world. And at the same time, he took advantage of the fact that the mortal renegade's Tao clones were not being properly controlled to fight them with full force. In all 1,080,000 worlds within the starry sky, his Tao clones attacked with everything they had. The war between Xiaochun and the mortal renegade that continued to be fought in all of those worlds was now different from earlier. Before, Xiaochun's Tao clones had been weaker, but now that Xiaochun had returned, they almost immediately gained the upper hand. And as a result, the brightness in the starry sky immediately began to surpass the darkness. Within the ruins of the immortal world, Xiaochun sat down cross-legged, his divine sense spread out as he used his true self's full power, all of his Tao, and even his sovereign aura, to cause everything around him to burst with light and life force. At the same time, he kept a bit of divine sense locked onto the mysterious dimension where the water swamp kingdom was located. That way, he would immediately be notified if the mortal renegade freed himself, and would go to block his path. One breath of time after another passed. Within the 1,080,000 worlds, the mortal renegade's Tao clones suffered defeat after defeat, and dazzling light continued to shine out. Soon, Xiaochun's divine sense caused all of the darkness to be driven from the immortal world, and the seed which had been planted there began to shine brightly. From a distance, the ruins of the immortal world looked like a dazzling candle. As soon as that candle sprang to life, Xiaochun shivered, at the sensation of that mysterious energy, once again coming into being. Apparently, after bringing light to the immortal world, that mysterious energy became vastly more distinct. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 1302, Essence of the Eternal. Chapter 1302, Essence of the Eternal. The ruins of the immortal world shone with dazzling light as, in the rest of the 1,080,000 worlds, the mortal renegade's Tao clones suffered defeat after defeat. In fact, in many of the ruins, Bai Xiaochun's Dao clones were sending out enough light to drive away the darkness. Because of the varying levels of light in different areas, it was no longer possible to assess the struggle between Bai Xiaochun and the mortal renegade merely by counting how many sets of ruins had been occupied by whom. However, if one could look down on the starry sky from an enormously high vantage point, they would see brightness overtaking darkness in numerous locations. Although the locations of the light were scattered randomly, the percent of the whole that was filled with light was now close to 70. The whole starry sky seemed to be lighting up, with life force growing more abundant. Furthermore, because the ruins of the immortal world had been lit up by Bai Xiaochun's true self, who possessed some of the chi flow of that world, it ensured that those ruins shone especially brightly. Although Bai Xiaochun's aura was rising rapidly, he felt little emotion. He had slipped into a strange state in which that mysterious energy was growing more and more clear. It's the essence of all living things, from the eternal world. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun realized that in addition to his Dao clones, the 1,080,000 worlds in the starry sky also had innumerable skeletons, which also contained some of that energy. It was the same even in that enormous river of coffins out in the starry sky. It's the ultimate source of the eternal world. Even the ruins themselves actually contained some of that energy, as did the countless particles of dust in the starry sky. It's the source of the eternal flower itself. At this point, he could sense that, as the eternal immortal domains floated through the starry sky, all of his friends and relatives there were on their knees, praying. At the same time, the mysterious energy was even more prevalent there. In fact, within the starry sky, there were two locations where it was strongest. The first was in the ruins of the immortal world, and the second was in the eternal immortal domains. Apparently, as nirvanic extermination had been brought to the countless races of living beings in the starry sky, that mysterious energy had begun to pour into the eternal immortal domains. And as the ruins of the immortal world grew bright, Bai Xiaochun began to gain enlightenment. Now he understood its essence, he murmured to himself. It's the essence of the eternal. The eternal flower was born out of the essence of the eternal. That's why that legend existed to begin with, that by consuming the eternal flower, one could step into the eternal realm. And thus, the mortal renegade's Tao was to bring nirvanic extermination to everything in existence. It was how his Tao came to be to begin with. And destroying everything was the only way to make sure the eternal flower had enough of the essence of the eternal. That method to become eternal is correct, but at the same time, incorrect. Consuming the eternal flower won't put you in the eternal realm. Instead, it enables you to unrightfully absorb the essence of the eternal. That is the mortal renegade's final Tao. As he gained enlightenment of these matters, the mysterious essence of the eternal grew more clear. But then, his eyelid twitched, and his trance was interrupted by the sensation of a powerful force of destruction rising up from within his water swamp kingdom. Almost as soon as he sensed it, a rift opened up above the ruins of the immortal world, and a voice spoke that boomed like heavenly thunder. I've heard that your name is Bai Xiaochun. It was like a growl of utter madness that echoed out from within the rift that had just opened up. In response, the starry sky twisted and distorted, and black smoke poured out, pulsing with frigid coldness that seemed capable of sealing anything it touched. Then, an incomparably shocking battleship began to emerge from the rift, pulsing with an insane, domineering air, and momentum to crush anything in its path. As the battleship slowly emerged from the rift itself began to shatter and crumble. Standing at the prow of the ship was a man with flowing black hair, whose eyes glowed with black light. He seemed like the most supreme being in all of heaven and earth, in all of the starry sky. He was the mortal renegade, Devil Imperator. Chaotic fluctuations rolled off him, making the starry sky in the area twitch and seize. And on his forehead, there was a sigil, a mark that almost looked like a wound. And yet, that was nothing compared to the most shocking aspect of the scene. There was no corpse on the ship. Instead, an illusory figure could be seen behind the mortal renegade, standing tall and straight. It was an old man in a gray robe, whose forehead had a wound just like the mortal renegade's.
As soon as that old man became visible, a boundless air of nirvanic extermination appeared.
Bai Xiaochun slowly looked up at the descending mortal renegade, and took note of the illusory old man standing behind him. From what he could tell, the mortal renegade was stronger than before, both in terms of his cultivation base and his battle spirit. However, it was also obvious that he had been wounded while in the world of the Water Swamp Kingdom. It was not a physical wound, but a wound to his soul and to his essence. And that wound was made manifest by the mark on his forehead. Bai Xiaochun rose to his feet and spoke, his voice echoing out, causing the starry sky to tremble and shake.
That's right, I'm Bai Xiaochun. But what about you? Are you the mortal renegade? Or are you from the outside world, the so-called holy extermination? It was almost as if he had formed a resonance with the starry sky itself, which caused his voice to speak from all of the 1,080,000 worlds that existed there. From the dark gleam in the mortal renegade's eyes, it was possible to not only see how he was weakened by the repeated exchanges earlier, but also that he was coming to realize how difficult Bai Xiaochun was to deal with. Even worse, Bai Xiaochun had clearly experienced a breakthrough of some sort. It was in that moment that the mortal renegade felt something he had never experienced after becoming a sovereign: fear. Their eyes met, and they looked at each other for a moment without exchanging any further words. Then, the rift completely fell apart as the battleship appeared fully in the open. At that point, the mortal renegade reached out and waved his hand. As he did, the light which had begun to overtake the 1,080,000 worlds suddenly shrank back. And then, the darkness that filled more than 30% of the starry sky suddenly erupted with a frigid chi. The light shining off of Bai Xiaochun's Dao clones could do nothing to the frozen 30% of the starry sky as the mortal renegade's Dao clones suddenly collapsed into black smoke that disappeared into the various ruins of the 1,080,000 worlds. When they reappeared, they were streaming toward the mortal renegade. As the black smoke fused back into him, and he recollected the Dao clones he had sent out, he began to grow larger and larger. In a very short time, he was the same enormous giant that he had been when he loomed over the eternal flower. Bai Xiaochun's eyes glittered upon the realization that this would be the final battle between himself and the mortal renegade. Taking a deep breath, he sent his divine sense out into the 1,080,000 worlds, and called back his Dao clones as well. Instantly, they all transformed into dandelion seeds, which swirled back to him, entering his body, and simultaneously causing him to grow larger and larger. Rumbling sounds echoed out as, from a distance, it was possible to see two enormous giants standing there, dwarfing the immortal world, large enough to hold up the starry sky itself. The time had come to fight. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 1303, Bitter and Desperate. Chapter 1303, Bitter and Desperate. It was the final battle. If the mortal renegade won, then the eternal immortal domains would be consumed. The eternal world would be plundered, and the mortal renegade would use the essence of the eternal to reach the eternal realm. The so-called holy extermination would take advantage of the rebirth of the mortal renegade to escape the dying eternal spirit world, to surpass his previous unknown cultivation level, and then slaughter the never-ending Dao domain. Bai Xiaochun knew all of that. Although he wasn't sure exactly what the never-ending Dao domain was, he did know that the people there feared the eternal spirit world. More specifically, they feared the essence of the eternal. Fully aware of all of this, Bai Xiaochun looked at the mortal renegade with glittering eyes. And then, the mortal renegade made his move, lunging forward with fist clenched to strike at Bai Xiaochun. He did not use any divine abilities or magical techniques. Based on his Dao, he knew that such things were of no use in this fight. Considering their current state, every fist strike that they launched could be considered a divine ability, a magical technique, or an expression of essence. In the end, great Daos were relatively simple. At this level, what might seem like an ordinary fist strike would actually contain all sorts of natural laws. They could ignore divine abilities cast their way in defense,
and could destroy ordinary sovereigns with impunity, killing them in body and soul. As for Bai Xiaochun, he also clenched his hand into a fist and let loose a punch. His blow was backed by his cultivation base, his fleshly body, his Tao, and everything else that made him up. It drew on the starry sky, causing it to twist and distort as a tempestuous rumbling sound echoed out. Booms rang as the two opponents exchanged more than 10,000 fist strikes. For the first 1,000, neither Bai Xiaochun nor the mortal renegade reacted with anything more than muffled grunts. But after 10,000, both were coughing up blood. As they battered each other, they began to shrink. After all, the blows they were sustaining contained massive force, and despite the both of them being the most powerful of sovereigns, they still had a hard time enduring. And the price they had to pay was their Tao clones. In some senses, each Tao clone was like an additional life for them. Each time they sustained a heavy enough blow to die, what died was one of their Tao clones. From that, it could be seen that, at this level, both Bai Xiaochun and the mortal renegade had already reached the point of being essentially undying. Each of them had 1,080,000 lives. Only after all 1,080,000 of their Tao clones perished would they actually be forced to draw upon the life of their true form. In the beginning, both Bai Xiaochun and the mortal renegade had been somewhat unsure of each other. Eventually, they had fought through space and time. And now, they were simply battering at each other desperately. Booms rang out, and they both coughed up blood. And as they shrank down, their Tao clones died, one after another. It didn't happen at exactly the same rate. Occasionally, the mortal renegade would gain the upper hand, and destroy some of Bai Xiaochun's Tao clones. Then the tide would turn, and some of the mortal renegade's Tao clones would be killed. And thus, they fought back and forth, starting at the location of the immortal world, but then leaping back and forth between the various ruins that dotted the starry sky. In some ways it was a pity that the only living beings in the starry sky existed in the eternal immortal domains, making it impossible for anyone to witness their desperate struggle. Either you die, or I die. Rumbling booms like heavenly thunder were the only sound that existed. Blood sprayed out of Bai Xiaochun's mouth, and his chest was caved in. He looked like he might collapse at any moment, to the point where his powers of regeneration did almost nothing. After all, the powers of the mortal renegade's nirvanic extermination could not be negated in a short period of time. On the other hand, the mortal renegade couldn't easily regenerate. Bai Xiaochun fought with the power of radiance and light, which was the perfect foil to the mortal renegade. And thus 10,000 fist strikes turned into 100,000. Then 200,000. 300,000. The starry sky was being destroyed, thrown into utter chaos, with ruins being transformed into ash left and right. You've earned my respect, Bai Xiaochun. However, you're not a match for me. Howling, the mortal renegade launched another attack. As for Bai Xiaochun, he laughed loudly as he joined the fight. As of this moment, he didn't fear death in the least. 500,000 fist strikes. 600,000, 700,000. Now they were less than half the size they had been when they had started. As the bitter fight wore on, they did not hesitate to shed Tao clones. Neither attempted to evade or flee. For the mortal renegade, it was because the only way to achieve his long-cherished wish was to kill Bai Xiaochun. It was different for Bai Xiaochun. He didn't fight with the reckless madness of the mortal renegade. He had started out that way, but as the fight wore on, he realized that doing so would have a negative impact on him. At that point, he considered trying to draw out the fight longer. However, that was also when he noticed something unusual. As his Tao clones died, and the fight went on, he actually was able to sense the essence of the eternal even more clearly. What exactly is the eternal? He thought, panting. But there was no time to ponder the subject now. All he could do was keep battering his foe. Time passed. It was hard to say how long it had been since they started fighting. Perhaps 10 years. Perhaps 20. Maybe even longer than that. Eventually, 700,000 fist strikes became 900,000.
Then 1,000,000.
At a certain point, they surpassed 1,080,000 fist strikes. Rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth as Dao clones fell, and the two combatants shrank further and further. Soon, the battlefield had reached the starry sky near the eternal immortal domains. From a distance, the eternal immortal domains glowed with soft light, and a sensation of life force that was highly conspicuous within the starry sky. As Bai Xiaochun and the mortal renegade neared, the living beings in the eternal immortal domains could sense what was happening. By now, they had been waiting for more than a full 60-year cycle for this fight to end. During those 60 years, they had not forgotten about Bai Xiaochun and the mortal renegade. It had been a time of deadly crisis for everyone, during which they had seen what appeared to be two stars in the sky, battering each other endlessly. Xiaobao had grown up, and both Dabao and Xiaoxiao now looked middle-aged. As for Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo, and Ho Xiaomei, they all looked as beautiful as they had before, except for their eyes, which sparkled with an ancient gleam. The Grand Heaven Master, the Giant Ghost King, and everyone else in the eternal immortal domains had spent the last 60 years praying ceaselessly. Eventually, the fight between the two sovereigns neared the eternal immortal domains, and at long last, everyone could see Bai Xiaochun. The mortal renegade wiped the blood from his mouth and glared at Bai Xiaochun.
Did you drag the fight here because this is where you want to die, Bai Xiaochun? If so, then I'll fulfill your wish.
At the moment, the mortal renegade had 10 Dao clones left, whereas Bai Xiaochun only had 3. And both of them were roughly the size of an ordinary person. Without any further talk, they attacked each other again, whereupon blood sprayed out both of their mouths, and they fell back from each other.
You only have 2 clones left.
Spinning, the mortal renegade turned into a shooting star that closed in on Bai Xiaochun with fury and death. Apparently, he was drawing more fully on his murderous aura than he had during the entire 60-year fight, as he unhesitatingly threw out 5 successive fist strikes. Their explosive power caused the starry sky to tremble, and blood to spray madly out of Bai Xiaochun's mouth. Even as his final 2 Dao clones collapsed, he threw 5 fist strikes back at the mortal renegade, destroying 2 of his remaining 10 Dao clones. However, the interchange was so devastating to Bai Xiaochun that many of his bones shattered, and he began to tumble down toward the eternal immortal domains. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Chapter 1304, Finger of All Heaven. Chapter 1304, Finger of All Heaven. Arch-Emperor. Father. Xiaochun.
The people in the eternal immortal domains saw that final blow, and it resulted in numerous gasps of despair as they watched Bai Xiaochun plummeting down toward the eternal sea. Up in the starry sky, the mortal renegade hovered, trembling, completely drained by the fight. Never in his life had he faced anyone as powerful or as difficult to deal with as Bai Xiaochun. It was only in this very moment that he managed to cut down all of Bai Xiaochun's Dao clones, with himself having only 8 left. Obviously, if Bai Xiaochun had time to recover, then it would be impossible to end the fight.
I won't give him that chance.
Eyes flashing, he reached out with his right hand, causing the starry sky to fill with rumbling sounds as his ancient battleship appeared once again. The pitch-black craft flew at top speed directly toward Bai Xiaochun, or more precisely, toward the eternal immortal domains. Clearly, the ship was set on a deadly collision course. The mortal renegade knew that Bai Xiaochun had intentionally dragged the fight toward the eternal immortal domains.
And yet, the mortal renegade's ultimate goal was the same location.
The shocking energy of the battleship became a black tempest that raged in all directions, filled with boundless darkness, nirvanic extermination, and endless death. Everything had come full circle.
The location of the beginning of the battle was now to be its end.
As the battleship neared, the eternal immortal domains began to crumble and collapse. Bai Xiaochun's vision swam, and his 5 yin organs and 6 yang organs were nearly destroyed, making him so weak that his powers of regeneration could do nothing to heal him at the moment. His injuries were simply too severe. The mortal renegade's final fist strike hadn't been enough to kill him, but had hurt him so badly he could hardly keep his eyes open. However, he could definitely see the ancient battleship arrive and begin its deadly approach toward the eternal immortal domains. And he knew that if the battleship struck, it would mean death for everyone. The reason I came back here was so that I could either die with my family and friends, or use the essence of the eternal to launch a fatal counterblow. As he wrestled to control his aura, as his eyes flickered with a scrap of hope, as the flame of his life force flickered on the verge of ultimate extinction, he could just barely sense something tugging at him. It was as if his current state made his connection to the essence of the eternal stronger than it had ever been in his life. What exactly is essence? He thought as he looked up into the sky at the black battleship, with the power of extermination radiating out from it. He could feel the eternal immortal domains trembling on the verge of complete collapse, and could sense the flames of life force within all the living beings beneath him flickering unstably. Essence has no form or shape, it's almost like it doesn't even exist, but simultaneously, it creates and contains every form and shape. In this moment, his eyes seemed to flicker like the starry sky as the essence of the eternal which existed in the eternal immortal domains, in the form of that mysterious energy, suddenly began to thrum in resonance with him. Essence has no beginning or end, he murmured, but simultaneously, creates and contains the beginning and end of everything. In response to his words, that mysterious energy exploded out, rushing to converge on him, swirling around him, creating an invisible windstorm. Essence takes up no space, but simultaneously, creates and contains all space. In response to those three sentences, the mysterious energy went wild, creating a frenzied, invisible vortex that halted by Xiaochun's fall, and left him hovering there in midair. Essence exists outside of time, but simultaneously, creates and contains all time. In response to his fourth sentence, the vortex of mysterious energy began to push by Xiaochun back up toward the starry sky. The starry sky trembled as if from the resonance of a great Tao. And the more than 1 million ruins, which had previously been frozen into darkness, began to tremble and crack. In response to all of this, the mortal renegade's eyes went wide, and his heart filled with tsunamis of shock. That's the aura of the eternal, he blurted. Almost at the same time, Bai Xiaochun's voice rose from the eternal immortal domains into the starry sky, to fill the eternal world. I still don't fully understand essence, and only know a bit about the eternal. He closed his eyes for a moment, and though he seemed very weak, when he opened them again, they shone with confidence. But I know that our lives resonate with the great Tao, and life force resonates with the most mysterious of secrets. And that is all I need to know to kill you, mortal renegade. In that instant, Bai Xiaochun began to burn a Tao flame, a fire of life and life force. Inside of him, shocking transformations began to occur, as though he were beginning to break out of the sovereign realm. Around him, the mysterious energy that was the manifestation of the essence of the eternal began to boil. As he sensed that, he extended his right hand toward the sky, and then pointed directly at the black battleship of destruction. There seemed to be little that was special about that gesture. It was no divine ability, and did not contain the fluctuations of a magical technique. However, it instantly caused the mortal renegade's face to fall. You! He shouted, but was unable to say anything more. The black battleship became like an illustration that was then erased out of existence by a massive, invisible hand. In the shortest of moments, it disappeared, starting from the prow and moving backward. As for its aura of death, it also vanished completely. There was absolutely no clue to indicate that the ship had ever existed. There were no ripples spreading out through the sky, or any other evidence. Bai Xiaochun's face was a bit paler than before. He had used the essence of the eternal, not to shift time like he had in the past, nor to attack the mortal renegade by guiding the mysterious energy. At the cost of his own life force, he created a resonance with the starry sky and the essence of the eternal, to direct that mysterious energy. Guiding and directing were two very different things. Although he was physically weak, his eyes now shone even brighter than ever as he extended his finger again. Up in the starry sky, the mortal renegade's heart was pounding.
As for all of the other living beings present, they couldn't possibly have been more flabbergasted by what was happening. Within the silence, the mortal renegade began to tremble, struck with the sensation that if he didn't stop Bai Xiaochun right now, he would never be able to do so. Bai Xiaochun seemed unsurpassably terrifying in this moment, to the point where the invisible holy extermination appeared behind the mortal renegade, equally stunned, memories of uncountable ancientness flickering in his eyes. Then, his lips moved, and although no sound came out, anyone who could have seen him would be able to see what he was saying. All heaven! Stop him! The mortal renegade shouted. The image of holy extermination screamed the same thing. And in almost the same instant, the two of them superimposed over one another, causing a third eye to open up on the mortal renegade's forehead, in the exact spot where the wound mark had once existed. When that eye opened, his gaze was no longer that of the mortal renegade, but rather, the so-called holy extermination. Radiating the most terrifying of fluctuations, he then shot toward Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun was currently being propped up by the mysterious energy that was the essence of the eternal. Rising toward the starry sky, and away from the eternal immortal domains, he prepared to meet the mortal renegade. And as he did, he pointed out with his finger for a second time. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 1305, The Mortal Renegade Perishes. Chapter 1305, The Mortal Renegade Perishes. As this second finger attack appeared, most of Bai Xiaochun's hair turned gray, and his skin suddenly lost its luster. His life force faded a bit, transforming into boundless power that created a great Tao resonance with the starry sky, as well as the essence of the eternal. As that resonance formed, the mysterious energy in the area poured into Bai Xiaochun's finger, and then shot toward the mortal renegade. The mortal renegade's face fell. Howling, he threw his hands out, causing intense black light to shoot out from his third eye. That black light formed a shield of numerous layers, so strong that not even the full-force attack of a sovereign would be able to penetrate it. Holding nothing back, he accelerated toward Bai Xiaochun. You might have stirred the eternal, but you are too weak. Once I get close enough, a single fist strike will be all I need to kill you. No expression could be seen on Bai Xiaochun's face, and yet, even as the mortal renegade spoke, he shivered. In that same moment, the black shield of light, which had seemed completely and utterly impenetrable, transformed into something like an illustration. Just like the black battleship from earlier, it was erased, layer by layer, revealing the mortal renegade behind it. The mortal renegade howled as his body began to collapse, and blood sprayed out of his mouth. Tears of blood oozed out of his third eye, and at the same time, his remaining 8 Tao clones all slipped away into death. The mortal renegade was trembling, and his aura was dramatically weakened. However, he still managed to survive Bai Xiaochun's second finger strike. Eyes shining with madness, he did not retreat, but instead, continued onward toward Bai Xiaochun. He moved with such incredible speed that he was soon only 30 meters away. Just when he was about to make his move, Bai Xiaochun looked at him, eyes expressionless as he pointed out with his finger a third time. As a result, his hair turned completely gray, and wrinkles spread out to cover his skin, making him look extremely old. Even his eyes looked dim and dull. He drove the essence of the eternal, directing the mysterious energy in a way that was profoundly draining. But, in the end, his finger strike still shot toward the mortal renegade. Nu! The mortal renegade howled in terror. His third eye was now completely gray, and even though he knew he couldn't withstand the force, he still pushed himself forward in a last-ditch effort to kill Bai Xiaochun. Before he could, though, he ran into the mysterious energy, and its power of erasure. He trembled as his body began to vanish, starting with his legs, and then his hands, and then his torso, and finally up his neck toward his head. The mortal renegade, who had destroyed 1,080,000 worlds, was now turning into nothing more than ash. In the last moments before his head vanished, his third eye suddenly twitched, turning even grayer than before. The mortal renegade vanished, and as he did, the third eye madly sucked in everything that made up his life and his Tao.
It was also in that moment that his eyes suddenly turned completely clear, and he looked at Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun shivered, thinking back to the memories of the worldly Taoist, and the time that locusts had filled the snowy lands, and how this very person had risked his life to find food for his younger brother. Right now, his eyes suddenly looked like they had back then. In that instant, he shouted his final words. "Little brother, you must kill holy extermination." Even as his words continued to echo out, his head vanished, erased out of existence forever. The mortal renegade was dead. However, that third eye of his exploded right before he vanished. As it did, masses of gray smoke erupted out to fight back against his third finger strike. Rumbling sounds could be heard as the mysterious energy faded away, and the third finger strike ended. At that point, the gray smoke collapsed, then formed back together into a human figure. It wasn't the mortal renegade, but rather an unadulterated aura of death and extermination. It seemed completely and utterly boundless, as though it were the purest and most ultimate expression of nirvanic extermination. Gradually, the figure took on the features of an old man in a gray robe. This was exactly the same figure Bai Xiaochun had seen when he shifted time, the holy extermination who had entered the eternal world on a battleship. Smiling faintly, the old man said, "What a pity that you can't unleash a fourth finger of all heaven." Then he shot toward Bai Xiaochun, becoming a gray blur that seemed intent on stabbing into his body. But as that blur neared, though, the weakened Bai Xiaochun spoke in a raspy voice. "You sure about that?" Even as the words left his mouth, he reached out and unleashed a fourth finger strike. The smile did not leave the old man's face, but instead transformed into a sneer of ridicule. He had fought countless powerful experts in his life, and knew that although Bai Xiaochun had a bit of strength left, it wasn't enough. Therefore, this had to be a bluff. And there was no way holy extermination would fall for a bluff. However, a moment later, his sneer froze, and his eyes shone with disbelief. "Impossible!" he cried. All of a sudden, he lurched to a halt, then tried to fall back. But he was too late. Bai Xiaochun's hair fell out of his head, and his body shrank and withered to the point where he was little more than skin and bones. He looked like an oil lamp on the verge of winking out forever, his life force wasted, and yet, not quite dead. In fact, not only was he not dead, but there was a powerful life force streaming out from inside of him. Obviously, it did not belong to him, and yet, it was so powerful that it easily directed the essence of the eternal. It was massively draining, and yet, it was enough to fuel a fourth finger strike. "This is impossible!" Holy extermination blurted in shock. He had planned everything out meticulously. He had even paid a heavy price to acquire a Tao puppet, which dealt with Bai Xiaochun's first three finger strikes. He had been sure that a fourth strike was impossible, and yet, based on the life force that was exploding out of Bai Xiaochun, he now realized that all of his plots had been in error. Where is that life force coming from? In his confusion, he didn't notice that, within the eternal immortal domains, in the reconstructed Archemperor city, the little turtle was shrieking as his body withered up, and his life force vanished. Twitching, he began to slide into unconsciousness. "I hate you, Bai Xiaochun," he said. Then he passed out. After all, back when Bai Xiaochun had discovered him, their lives had become linked. If Bai Xiaochun died, he would die too. After all the years that had passed, the little turtle had forgotten about that fact. No other entity which might have been linked to Bai Xiaochun could possibly have fueled a fourth finger strike. But the little turtle was not only the eternal turtle, he was also from beyond the starry sky. And thus, his seemingly endless supply of life force could most definitely bolster Bai Xiaochun's remaining strength to unleash a fourth strike. As the fourth finger strike was unleashed, massive fluctuations rocked the starry sky. In his exhaustion, Bai Xiaochun's eyes began to close, too weak to stay open. He lost control of his body, and began to float back down toward the eternal immortal domains. And as he did, holy extermination let out a howl of unprecedented frustration. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc.
Please let us know report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 1306, Merciless All Heaven. Chapter 1306, Merciless All Heaven. There wasn't even time for him to tremble. Under the power of the mysterious fourth finger strike, he collapsed into ashen sparks that attempted to flee. The mysterious energy continued to pursue the ash and wipe it away, but it was tenacious, and moments later, formed back into holy extermination. This time, his eyes flickered with fear as he once again fled. However, there was no way for him to escape his fate of death. The mysterious energy smashed at him again, reducing him to ashes yet another time. When the ashes formed back into a human shape again, holy extermination was far weaker than before. This process repeated itself over and over again. Before long, his legs could not reform, nor his arms or legs. Eventually, the only thing that remained was half of his torso and his head. I refuse to accept this. He howled bitterly. Moments before, he had been only a step away from succeeding and becoming eternal. But now, it was in completely unexpected fashion that he found himself crushed in defeat. Then, even as his head was on the verge of fading away, he looked over at by Xiaochun in the eternal immortal domains, his eyes shining in profoundly sinister nature. If I can't succeed, then I'll just let another all heaven rise from the eternal spirit world. All heaven is supposed to be merciless, but you have too many connections. How could you truly be all heaven? Well, I guess I'll provide you with the help you need. Henceforth, you will be merciless and unfeeling. You will have no family or friends. Your past will be buried, and you will be baptized by pitilessness. Then, as all heaven, you will exterminate the never-ending Tao domain. As holy extermination laughed madly, an unprecedentedly dark beam of light shot out of his eyes. Instantly, that black light shot toward the eternal immortal domains. As it neared, it spiraled out to create a massive vortex down below. Intense rumbling sounds mixed with cries of alarm from the people below as the mysterious energy then swept over to wipe it out of existence. But holy extermination knew that he couldn't destroy the eternal immortal domains. After all, resurrecting people of lower cultivation levels than oneself was not an impossibility, so killing the people of the lands would do little to advance his purposes. Therefore, his goal was not destruction. It was something else. By giving my boundless life force as the price, and by using the three great domain treasures of the vast expanse Tao domain, I will open the river of time and space. As his voice caused the starry sky to tremble, the vortex spun madly, moving faster and faster until three objects became visible within them. One was a feng shui compass, one was a black pearl, and one was a white pearl. All three of them radiated a completely ancient air, and caused the vortex around them to whip into a complete frenzy. My three domain treasures were sealed for all eternity, and cannot be unleashed in full. But they are definitely enough to cause the river of time and space to open. As holy extermination's voice echoed out, it began to stretch and distort. Simultaneously, the vortex seemed to be opening a way into a strange and indescribable world, causing the starry sky and all the ruins that filled it to be cast into complete chaos. Beneath the eternal immortal domains, and within the vortex, a huge river could be seen, surging with huge waves. As soon as the river became visible, a massive force of attraction sprang up, grabbing the eternal immortal domains and pulling them down into the river. The river contained a familiar, mysterious energy, and a sensation of the eternal. It contained time itself, as well as an infinitude of essences. It was wholly beyond compare, as if it were the most important thing within the entire starry sky. As Bai Xiaochun realized what was happening, his eyes went wide, and his mind began to reel. "Nu!" He shouted madly, blue veins bulging out on his neck and face, his body shaking. Unfortunately, he was simply too weak to even move, let alone stop what was happening. "This is my gift to you, all heaven. Don't even think about trying to bring them back. They are now sealed within the river of time and space. In all creation, including the 9 great Tao domains,
I've never heard of a single person who could pull an entire world out of the river of time and space."
Chuckling, holy extermination faded away.
As for that enormous holy river, and the eternal immortal domains, they also faded away.
Everything went silent.
The river of time and space was gone, and holy extermination was dead.
Everything was over.
The starry sky was quiet now, and the frozen 1,080,000 ruins were unsealed.
Light began to shine everywhere.
However, in the spot where the eternal immortal domains had once existed, Xiaochun hovered, looking down blankly at where the river had just been.
He couldn't think.
It was almost as if he had become an empty person, technically alive, but essentially dead.
Soulless.
After a long moment passed, he coughed up a mouthful of blood, and then collapsed into unconsciousness. If it weren't for the fact that his lips still quivered a bit, as though he were talking to himself, he would easily be taken for a corpse, drifting forever through the starry sky. Although the 1,080,000 ruins all shone with bright light, he was the only person left, unconscious, directionless. Time passed, although it was impossible to determine how much.
Eventually, Xiaochun woke up.
Before he could open his eyes, he heard voices calling out to him.
"You're finally awake, Daddy. Look, I'm all grown up."
Daddy, Xiaochun had a cultivation base breakthrough.
She's a celestial now. Father, I want to get married.
As soon as Xiaochun heard the voices of his children, a smile broke out on his face. He also heard warm, tender voices speaking to him that he knew were Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo, Ho Xiaomei, and Gong Sun Waner.
There was also another female voice, somewhat unfamiliar. "Xiaochun, it's me. Du Lingfei."
As the voices joined together, Xiaochun felt as though countless eyes were locked onto him, all of them smiling. He could sense Uncle Li, the Grand Heaven Master, the Giant Ghost King, Big Fatty Zhang, Song Ke, Master God Diviner, and others.
He was content.
He felt the sun shining on him, and could smell the fragrant odor of spring.
Everyone was healthy and happy.
Although he didn't want to, he eventually opened his eyes. There he floated in the starry sky, tears streaming down his cheeks. The voices vanished. The only thing he could see now was the starry sky, which was completely and utterly quiet. Eventually, he righted himself, looked around, and began to travel through the starry sky, until he was back where the eternal immortal domains had once existed.
He began to weep. "I defeated the mortal renegade, only to lose everything else."
As his tears fell down into the starry sky, he reached out to grasp at something, but there was nothing there. He wanted to take some alcohol out of his bag of holding, but didn't have any to take out. He could only hover there in the starry sky, blank, thinking about the past. One day he looked up, madness flickering in his eyes as he performed an incantation gesture. Unleashing the power of the time immemorial codex, he shifted time and vanished. However, it didn't take long before he returned. Not even using his time-shifting abilities were any help in locating the eternal immortal domains. Apparently, when something entered the river of time and space, all traces of its existence were completely removed. "The river of time and space," he said gratingly. His voice seemed to contain boundless grief that could not be dispelled, neither with tears nor anything else. And thus, the pain inside of him built up to the point where even his voice changed. "They've been sealed in the river of time and space, but they're not dead. If holy extermination can open it, then so can I." Panting, he unleashed the power of his cultivation base and began to try various methods to access the river. He tried to use the essence of the eternal and its mysterious energy, but soon realized that with the departure of the eternal flower, that mysterious energy was vastly weaker. It might as well have not been there. Without its original source, the essence of the eternal was almost useless. The starry sky was bright now, but with the eternal flower gone, Xiaochun was the only living being in existence. And thus, the essence of the eternal had faded. However, he was not ready to give up. He performed test after test, wearing himself ragged in the process.
Nothing worked.
In the end, he still had no idea how to open the river of time and space. Although he was in pain, he was not in complete despair. He closed his eyes to think for a while, and when he opened them, they shone with more determination than ever. If the sovereign realm isn't strong enough to open it, he murmured, then maybe it means I have to reach the eternal realm. Supposedly, absorbing the eternal flower was the only way to reach the eternal realm. But during his fight with the mortal renegade, he had controlled the mysterious energy that was the essence of the eternal, and had thus come to realize that there were definitely other ways. The essence of the eternal is contained in all living things.
It is in all essences.
Although it is weak, it is always there. If hosts of living beings could exist in the starry sky again, and begin to practice cultivation, then cultivators would multiply, and the essence of the eternal would appear again.
If the eternal doesn't exist now, then I'll create it. As living beings awaken and life force spreads, essence will appear. If enlightenment of one essence isn't enough, I'll study 10 of them. 100. 1,000. 10,000. If I have to, I'll understand the essence of all living things in all 1,080,000 worlds in the starry sky. After combining all of the essences, I can reach the eternal realm. Eyes shining with near hysteria, he decided that this was definitely his only option, but turning to look in the direction of the former eternal immortal domains, he spoke in a voice filled with ultimate focus. The eternal immortal domains. My home. All of you, just wait for me. I promise I'll find you.
If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Chapter 1307, Starting Point. Chapter 1307, Starting Point.
There is a force which exists in all people.
In some, it can be abundant without limit. In others, it can be scarce to the extreme.
It can propel some people to the point of shaking heaven and earth, and in other people, it can weaken them to the point of collapsing forever. It can give rise to endless determination, or it can remove it in an instant.
That force comes from focus.
By Xiaochun's focus, his obsession, was to extract the eternal immortal domains from the river of time and space. It was a focus that bordered on insanity, and instantly became the most important aspect of his life.
If there is no eternal, then I will create it. If there is no essence, then I will create it. If there is no life, then I will create it.
As he looked in the direction where the eternal immortal domains had once existed, his eyes shone with profound light. Eventually, he closed his eyes, and settled down cross-legged in the middle of the starry sky. In the past, it had never occurred to him to wonder why there had been sunlight within the body of the arch-ancestor. Nor had he considered why the eternal immortal domains had a sun and a moon, even though the starry sky was pitch black. He hadn't even thought about such things after becoming an Archean. Upon becoming a sovereign, he qualified to understand such matters, but because of the fight with the mortal renegade, he had never had the time. But now, here in the middle of the starry sky, he began to ponder the subject. Whether it was the heaven-span realm or the eternal immortal domains, it was all the same. All suns and moons inside of the eternal flower were provided by the eternal mother.
And that was because life requires sunlight. He murmured.
His eyes opened, and his left eye began to shine with brilliant light that quickly came to resemble that of a sun. That light, of course, came from the forefather transformation that he had cultivated many years ago. Now that he had reached the sovereign realm, it was boundlessly bright. First, it spread out through the starry sky to touch all of the 1,080,000 worlds, where the light then formed into numerous glowing spheres.
They were suns. There were now 1,080,000 suns, all of which were also by Xiaochun's left eye. The presence of the suns completely changed the starry sky, and caused all of the 1,080,000 sets of ruins to tremble physically. And yet, things weren't over yet. By Xiaochun's right eye now began to glow, but this time with something much softer, moonlight. But if the 1,080,000 worlds had suns, how could they go without moons? 1,080,000 moons formed, and the combination of the suns and moons gave night and day to the starry sky. The sun and moon in the eternal immortal domains were illusory constructions provided by the Eternal Mother. As for these suns and moons, they were not illusory, they were real, and they were by Xiaochun's eyes. With suns and moons, with night and day, all that is needed now are seeds, the seeds of life. Bai Xiaochun didn't move, but the life force within him formed into seeds that began to drift out of him and fly toward the 1,080,000 worlds. Bai Xiaochun remained in place, cross-legged. He would not rise to his feet again, but instead, would stay there guarding the spot where his home had vanished. However, his eyes filled the starry sky. And if he wanted, he could appear anywhere. Years passed. The suns and moons and the myriad of worlds in the starry sky continued their dance. Eventually, the various ruins began to show signs of life. The seeds that Bai Xiaochun had planted were already beginning to grow. 100,000 years passed. Blue seas turned into mulberry fields. Suns rose, and moons set. The battle of years past was nothing but ancient history. And no one had been alive to witness it, making it nearly unreal. In fact, no one even knew about Bai Xiaochun. His name was a thing of the past. The 1,080,000 sets of ruins in the eternal spirit world were changing. Rains and winds touched them, and because of Bai Xiaochun's abundant life force, the crumbled buildings and structures had long since collapsed into dust, and disappeared into nothing. One day, on one of those former ruined worlds, the first living things appeared. They were small, so small that they were invisible to the naked eye. They would even be difficult to detect with divine sense. They were not conscious, and were extremely small and weak. But they were abundant. Apparently, they had come to exist because of the sunlight itself, and before long, they were not just on one world. One by one, living things appeared in all of the 1,080,000 worlds. They did not have any specific shape, and in fact, were difficult to describe with words. But they were there. Even in the former location of the eternal immortal domains, where Bai Xiaochun sat cross-legged in meditation, those living things came to be. Because of the birth of these living things, the starry sky changed. It was no longer dead and still. Instead, life force began to build. The suns and moons that were Bai Xiaochun's eyes took note of them, and watched for tens of thousands of years, as they changed the 1,080,000 sets of ruins. At this point, they weren't really ruins anymore. Life had returned to the 1,080,000 worlds, and there was no trace of any wreckage or rubble. In fact, because of the rain that had long since begun to fall, many of the worlds had seas and oceans. Some of the worlds even had hills, and areas where dust had congealed into mud. One day, tiny bacteria appeared within the depths of one of those oceans, which began to grow and spread through the water. In different worlds, the living things bore different appearances. For example, there were some worlds with no oceans, with the only water existing in deep mud. It was from that mud that the living beings emerged. When the first living things came to exist, Bai Xiaochun appeared. He looked down into the water, then waved his hand to pull up some of the bacteria. After examining them, he closed his eyes. Soon, very soon, he vanished, and the bacteria he had picked up floated back down into the ocean. Bacteria continued to thrive in the following years. The oceans changed, the lands changed, and the worlds changed. Soon, all of the 1,080,000 worlds pulsed with life force. In some worlds, the sky was azure, and the sun and moon shone dazzlingly. The clouds which rolled across the skies of such worlds would entrance anyone who could have seen them. In some worlds, lightning crashed, and black clouds filled the skies. Although it was an awe-inspiring sight, it was the perfect environment for the living things there. Some worlds were parched and hot, but at the same time, were perfect places for living things to thrive. Within the 1,080,000 worlds were all sorts of living creatures, and all sorts of natural laws. Countless essences came into being, all of which conformed to the magical laws that governed life in general.
Xiaochun watched the worlds, and studied the living beings that were multiplying there. Several tens of thousands of years passed. Eventually, new types of beings came to exist within the various worlds. These beings had no bones, and were soft-bodied. Some had shells, others did not, and they looked strange and bizarre. Some of them were aggressive, while others were completely passive. There were some who would vanish if they were simply touched. However, the existence of these new beings brought a splash of color to what had once been a very monotonous starry sky. More years passed, until finally, plants appeared in one of the worlds. The first plant was tiny, and bore a passing semblance to grass. It was about the size of a human fingernail, and if one could have looked closely at it, they would have seen tiny veins spreading out to fill its interior. Xiaochun appeared near the plant, knelt down, and looked at it. It was weak, but tenacious, and when he sensed the life flowing through it, he smiled for the first time in a long time. Soon. Very, very soon. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Chapter 1308 Guidance. Beginning. Chapter 1308 Guidance. Beginning. Time continued to pass. The presence of plants seemed to mark the beginning of a new age. In different worlds, the plants would be different colors and shapes, and would behave differently due to the different magical laws. But in the end, they were all still plants. Countless varieties of plants. Plants filled the oceans and the lands, the mountains and the hills. Everything. Over the course of the following tens of thousands of years, the sun shone down onto the bacteria, soft-bodied creatures, and plants, who were now the rulers of the various worlds that filled the starry sky. Eventually, fish appeared in the oceans, as well as creatures who could live on the shores of the waters, but could not venture far from it. One day, Xiaochun's eyes out in the starry sky spotted what looked like frogs or toads, and yet, were different from either of those animals. Eventually, lizard-like animals appeared in the grasslands. The suns that were by Xiaochun's eyes glittered in response. In that moment, all living creatures within the starry sky suddenly heard a voice speaking in their souls. Very soon. When that voice spoke, all of the plants stretched toward the sky, and all of the animals looked up. Even the fish stopped moving. Although the strange moment soon passed, all of the living beings had been touched, marked in a way that would stay with them and their descendants forever, even as they went about their lives of eating and hunting for food. The wheel of time continued to turn for 100,000 years. Or perhaps it was 1 million. Maybe longer. As the animals in the worlds flourished, flying creatures eventually appeared, who soared in the air above the lands they lived in. The appearance of birds seemed to mark yet another new age. Then, even newer animals began to appear, animals that were not born from eggs. They were more active and intelligent than anything which had come before, and were truly causing the starry sky to awaken. Over the endless years that followed, innumerable types of living creatures appeared in the worlds in the starry sky. They struggled and fought amongst each other for supremacy, with the weaker ones disappearing, and the stronger ones surviving. Xiaochun would occasionally observe, and one day, noticed a monkey-like creature using a rock to fight its enemies. Eventually, such creatures realized that moving about on all fours was not convenient when using rocks in that manner, and thus, took to standing on two legs. At that point, Xiaochun's expression shone with unprecedented brightness. He watched as these two-legged creatures began to live in groups, and hunt in organized fashion. Then one day, lightning struck a tree near some of them, and their eyes flickered with fear from the resulting fire. However, now that they had learned to use simple weapons, they became the ultimate domineering force on that world. Such groups of advanced living beings appeared in one world after another. In each of these worlds, the dominant groups of creatures came from different origins. Some started out as monkeys, others as birds. Others rose from living stone, and others were creatures of the air itself. There were all types of beings in the worlds, all of whom sprang forth from the natural laws which governed them. Xiaochun didn't just observe passively.
Although he didn't encourage any of them to begin using weapons, he did help them to take fire away from the burning trees which were struck by lightning. He helped the flying creatures learn to use the power of the wind to their advantage. He helped the stone-like creatures understand what it meant to build structures. He was always there to guide them, until they started to develop intelligence. What is wisdom and intelligence? He thought on one dark night as he stood on a mountain, looking down into a valley at a group of savages crouched around a fire, wearing animal skins and shouting loudly. Although there was clearly nothing civilized about them, the delight in their eyes as they stared into the fire caused by Xiaochun to sink into a state of thoughtfulness. Eventually, he waved his hand toward the fire, which suddenly raged to life, startling the surrounding humans. Trembling, they scattered into the darkness. After a moment passed, one of the savages crept forward, pointing at the fire and crying out in incredulity. In response, other savages crept back and looked more closely at the fire, where they realized a shadowy figure was visible. He wore a long robe, the likes of which they had never seen before. He had long hair, and was very tall. As he stood there in the fire, he looked off into the distance. He was none other than a projection of Bai Xiaochun. He was interested in seeing how these savages, these progenitors of humankind, would react to seeing a shadowy form inside of the fire. The first savage to have noticed him in the fire was also the first to drop to his knees, crawl forward, and then begin to bow in fanatical worship. Other savages followed, and soon, all of them were bowing zealously. At this point, Bai Xiaochun had gained the information he sought, and the figure in the flames began to fade away. When it vanished, the flames leapt higher, illuminating the sky, and casting terror into the hearts of the wild beasts in the surrounding mountains and valleys. From that point on, that group of savages would always stare into the fire with respect. And when they went on hunts, they would collect small, valuable items, which they would toss into the fire. The savages would look on with shining eyes as such sacrifices were transformed into ash, and then, they would drop down in worship. The first of the savages to have seen the image in the fire eventually took the sap of trees and plants and drew a picture on himself to represent fire. He quickly rose to a position of authority within that group of savages, a scene which Bai Xiaochun found to be particularly relevant. All of a sudden, certain matters clicked in his mind. Wisdom and intelligence begin with imagination. Imagination can turn a rock into a weapon. Imagination can turn fire into a way to drive away darkness. Imagination can make gods to worship, and form them into totems. When you take imagination and combine it with action, you have the first sprout of wisdom and intelligence. Bai Xiaochun looked at the savages one last time, then closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was in another world, where he began to guide the imaginations of the countless groups of living beings that now existed. Time passed. As Bai Xiaochun guided the living beings of the 1,080,000 worlds, their imaginations eventually led them to believe in the existence of heaven and earth. And eventually, Bai Xiaochun came to be a deity to them. As the hosts of living beings developed, their life essence also grew. And because of the marks that were branded on their souls, Bai Xiaochun was always with them. Different peoples had different deities that they would worship. Some people worshipped the sun. Others called their god the creator. Others called him the sky deity. Different names existed among different peoples. The Almighty, God the Father, the Stone Ancestor, the Wind Spirit, and many more. The people in the various worlds continued to grow strong, and as certain groups reached the pinnacle of life, civilization came to be. Civilization looked different on different worlds. Some places had cities and buildings, which were organized into countries. Others were clan-based. Others were completely unique. Some civilizations took to the skies, and lorded it over the lands. Others ruled from the land. Every conceivable type of civilization came to be, and flourished. However, regardless of what type of living beings they were, or how their civilization advanced, they all reached a point where they wanted to be closer to their God. They wanted mystical power, and even the ability to become gods themselves. And when that happened, it was time for Bai Xiaochun to yet again appear, to provide the final bit of guidance, and the final beginning. And thus, the concept of cultivation became a host of seeds that floated out into the starry sky. A few thousand years later, all of the peoples of all of the worlds had mystical powers. A new cultivation world had come to be in the eternal spirit world. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Chapter 1309, Seeing God. Chapter 1309, Seeing God. After providing the last bit of guidance, Bai Xiaochun didn't pay any further attention to the living beings in the multitude of worlds in the starry sky. He sat down cross-legged in the place where the eternal immortal domains had disappeared, which, over the years, had gradually become a landmass. Bai Xiaochun closed his eyes, and as the years passed, and he remained completely motionless, he became a statue. During the process in which life had sprang up from nothing and eventually reached a flourishing state, Bai Xiaochun never once felt the essence of the eternal, or the mysterious energy. After the eternal flower fell into the river of time and space, the essence of the eternal faded so much that, perhaps it had vanished completely. After the creation of life, Bai Xiaochun murmured, the next step is enlightenment of essence. With that, he sent his divine sense out into the starry sky, and began to seek enlightenment from the natural laws that had risen up along with the countless living beings. Years ago, his Tao had been that of lighting up the starry sky to become a sovereign. And he had accomplished that. In fact, he had gone beyond bringing light to the starry sky, he had also brought life back to it. But now, he wasn't concerned about his cultivation base. He needed to understand the essence of all of the multitude of worlds in the starry sky, and then use that understanding to make the eternal. Wait for me, all of you. It will be soon, very soon. As time passed, he became a part of the starry sky itself as he sought the enlightenment he needed. This time, it wasn't 10,000 years that passed. Nor was it 1 million. It was longer than that. Eventually, it reached the point of being incalculable. Among the 1,080,000 worlds in the starry sky, Bai Xiaochun was ancient history, whose existence would only be mentioned in the most ancient of records. As generations came and went, people stopped believing in the old legends about the origin of cultivation. People began to believe that their cultivation came from their own power. The seeds that Bai Xiaochun had scattered years ago were forgotten by the people of the starry sky. They created new techniques, divine abilities, and schools of magic. The cultivation world thrived, and wars were fought. Years and years passed. Countless talented individuals spent their lives studying the practice of cultivation, noting their errors and mistakes, and passing on information to further generations. Eventually, by building on the failures of past generations, a celestial arose, the first within the 1,080,000 worlds. That celestial obtained the approval of the world in which he lived, and tried to do something completely grand and dramatic, something that no one before him had ever done. He tried to break out from the world in which he lived, to step into the starry sky. Sadly, despite spending his whole life in that attempt, and using up all the resources he had managed to accumulate, he failed. But eventually, more celestials appeared among the various peoples of the various worlds. The cultivation world in this starry sky had entered the age of celestials. All celestials dreamed of leaving the worlds they came from and of stepping out into that starry sky. After all, they were convinced that the only way to become more than a celestial was to seek a path in what was beyond the heavens they knew. Unfortunately, none of those celestials succeeded. No matter how spectacular they were, when they reached the limits of the heavens, they could do nothing more than take half a step into the starry sky. More years passed. As more and more celestials appeared, eventually, one of them reached the Archean realm. He was an old man, and when he achieved his breakthrough, the sound of his laughter filled his world. Everyone watched in envy and excitement as he floated up toward the limits of the sky. I, Samanan, have finally broken through. This is the legendary Archean realm. Laughing heartily,
he flew up and stepped out into the starry sky. The starry sky. The starry sky. As he hovered there, he looked around, both excited and filled with ambition. His goal, to see the whole starry sky with his own eyes, to search it and find out if other worlds existed. In the years to follow, he would indeed appear in one world after another. The cultivation world had entered the era of the starry sky. As the first Archean in the starry sky, he spent more than 1,000 years traveling amongst worlds. He visited over 10 of them. Considering how powerful his cultivation base was, it was easy for him to conquer them. However, he couldn't take the people of the world away with him, nor could he bring people from his home world there to colonize them. Therefore, he would plunder the worlds he conquered, and then move on. The excitement of conquering worlds soon faded. However, in the calm that came afterward, he came to be convinced that he was the ultimate existence within this starry sky. Unless another Archean appeared, he was definitely the most powerful expert there was. Being invincible is actually fairly lonesome, he thought, sighing. He was currently sitting cross-legged on a huge sword made of bone, flying through the starry sky, looking for another world to explore. Suddenly, he turned to look in a different direction. Over there. Is something calling out to me? He frowned. This was his first time experiencing anything like this within the starry sky. Confident in the level of his cultivation base, he chuckled coldly, and began to head in the direction of the call. Let's see who or what dared to try to summon me. Eyes shining with lofty coldness, he proceeded along for an entire 60-year cycle. Sometimes he would grow suspicious about the situation, and about how far away this call was coming from. Just what exactly is calling to me? He thought, frowning. Soon, he realized that something strange was happening. The call was actually coming, not from some distant location, but from within his soul. Something was urging his soul to travel to some specific location. However, Sima Nan still felt confident in his cultivation base, and therefore, continued onward at full speed. The location he was being called to wasn't actually as far away as he had thought. After another 60-year cycle passed, he noticed a landmass some distance away in the starry sky. Don't tell me this awful place is another world? He looked around, chuckling coldly. During the past 2 60-year cycles, the urgings of his soul had come to be quite annoying to him. Sending divine sense out, he confirmed that there was nothing dangerous in the area, and then continued on toward the landmass. As Sima Nan landed on the continent, it was to his surprise that he didn't find any life at all. And yet, the thirst within his soul actually grew more intense. He was feeling extremely suspicious about the whole thing, but had spent 2 60-year cycles to get to this place, and knew he couldn't just look around briefly and then leave. After a moment of thought, his eyes turned cold, and he blurred into motion, following the tugging of his soul deep into the landmass. Eventually, he caught sight of a mountain. It was actually the only mountain on the entire landmass, and at its peak was a statue of a person, seated cross-legged in meditation. The instant Sima Nan saw that statue, he shivered, and his mind began to spin. That statue, that statue. His soul was shivering in much the same way that a child would when catching sight of his father. Unable to control himself, Sima Nan flew over to the statue and dropped down to kowtow to it. To his utter shock, he recognized this statue. It was very similar to statues he had seen among his own people, and even in the peoples of the other worlds he had visited. And it was connected to a legend that only a few people knew of. As for those who had heard of the legend, they all assumed it was a fairy tale of some sort. Sima Nan had also believed the same thing. Upon realizing that the gods depicted on numerous worlds, including his own, were all the same, he had felt that something strange was going on, but had eventually dismissed such thoughts. But now, upon seeing this statue, all of those old memories resurfaced. Based on the fluctuations of his soul, he knew that the legends were true. This statue had not been placed here by any group or people. Sima Nan could sense the truth based on his cultivation base and his soul. This statue was alive.
When standing in front of it, Sima Nan's cultivation base felt completely insignificant. He could tell that, with a single thought, this statue could destroy, not just him, but his entire world. Perhaps even the entire starry sky. This statue was the same person who was mentioned in the legends of the world Sima Nan had visited. He was the sun god of ancient times, who was the source of everything that existed. "I've seen God," Sima Nan murmured. Trembling, he prostrated himself in front of the statue, and remained there, unmoving. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 13:10 With a stir of will, tribulation appears. Chapter 13:10 With a stir of will, tribulation appears. Sima Nan did not leave. After finding the statue of Bai Xiaochun, which he understood to be God, he chose to stay behind and stand guard over it. In fact, he went so far as to officially declare that location hallowed ground within the starry sky. He soon found that there were mysterious properties to the area that aided his cultivation. Time seemed to flow differently there. These facts prompted Sima Nan to excitedly kowtow and worship to the statue. As years passed in which he worshipped Bai Xiaochun and stood guard, he became a much calmer and more peaceful person. However, whenever he looked at the statue, his eyes would burn with unmatchable fervor. And thus, time passed. Eventually, another Archean appeared from within the 1,080,000 worlds, and then a third, and a fourth. Archeans began to appear from within all of the peoples that inhabited the starry sky. Although not every Archean would choose to journey through the starry sky, many did. None of them were able to conquer numerous other worlds like Sima Nan had done back when there were no other Archeans. However, they were very excited to travel the stars and visit new places. Eventually, a second Archean felt a calling within his soul, and found the same location as Sima Nan. His appearance was dramatically different from Sima Nan's. He looked almost like an enormous boulder. However, as soon as he saw the statue of Bai Xiaochun, he also trembled, and began to offer worship. Eventually, a third Archean came, and then a fourth. Eventually, more than 20 found Bai Xiaochun's statue. And soon, from that very location, myths regarding the most ancient of times began to spread through the starry sky. As more and more worlds learned of Bai Xiaochun, increasing numbers of cultivators began to study the ancient records, in which they found descriptions of a history long past. As cultures made contact with each other, and shared knowledge, they were shocked to find that similar myths were present everywhere in the starry sky. The sun god, the moonlight immortal, the creator, the wind spirit, the stone ancestor, the almighty. As the peoples of the starry sky came to realize the true name behind all of the titles of their deities, it led to a storm of astonishment. God actually exists. He created our world, and life itself. It was him. He founded the cultivation world. The legends and myths were turning out to be reality, causing a massive uproar in the cultivation world. More Archean experts began to make the pilgrimage to the statue of Bai Xiaochun, to bask in its light, and to experience the holy aura of the area. Eventually, it was considered a great honor to be able to travel to that land. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun earned a new title: Origin of the Starry Sky. The wonderment of myth becoming reality did not fade with the passage of years. Eventually, Sima Nan passed away, as did all of the original Archeans who had discovered Bai Xiaochun and stood guard over him. A new generation of Archeans came, following the call within their souls, hoping to draw closer to God. They also chose to stand guard over Bai Xiaochun. However, not all living beings have the same temperament, personality, and way of thinking. Among the 1,080,000 worlds, there were some powerful experts who did not feel reverence for Bai Xiaochun. Some wished to usurp him. Kill God, and we can become immortal divinities. That became the new focus and obsession of many. Years later, as the Archeans grew stronger and more powerful, a sovereign finally appeared within the starry sky.
Sovereigns existed on a completely different and higher level than Archeans, so as soon as one appeared, it shook the very fabric of the starry sky. Furthermore, this sovereign was not interested in peace. And therefore, the people he encountered had two choices: submit to new rulership, or die in the flames of war. After subjugating the majority of the starry sky, the sovereign's subjects were as vast as the grains of sand in a sea. And at that point, he made a decision. He traveled to the very center of the starry sky, to that legendary hallowed land, where he stood in front of the statue of Xiaochun and challenged him to a fight to the death. It was an event that was profoundly shocking to all of the various peoples who inhabited the starry sky. And yet, before anyone could travel to watch the battle be fought, it was over. The Archean experts who were standing guard in the hallowed land at the time were able to record the battle in jade slips. Those images were later spread among cultivators, all of whom were flabbergasted by what they saw, and were prompted to immediately drop to the ground and offer obeisance in the direction of the hallowed land. The images in the jade slips showed that sovereign flying like a meteor toward the statue, radiating the power of essence, causing everything around him to shake violently. As he neared the statue of Xiaochun, the statue didn't even move. And yet, the sovereign crumbled into pieces, erased out of existence, leaving absolutely nothing behind. No one knew what level of power could do something like this, and thus, they simply called it the power of God. And no one dared to challenge the power of God. More years passed, and the starry sky entered an age of sovereigns. The story of God wiping a sovereign out of existence became a legend, and the will of the numerous worlds in the starry sky gave approval for more cultivators to become sovereigns. Eventually, a sovereign appeared amongst the other sovereigns, who was supremely powerful, and whose Tao differed from all other sovereigns. He devoured other entities, almost like a black hole, and eventually, he became the second cultivator to challenge God. He sought to devour God, and thus become a god himself. The guardians of the hallowed land of the statue were shocked, but could do nothing to stop him. They could only watch as the most powerful sovereign of the era strode toward the mountain on which the statue stood, his hands clasped behind his back. God, I believe in your existence, but even more so, I believe that you are a relic of the past. Who cares that you've existed down to this day? Instead of sticking around uselessly, why not become a stepping stone for me? He slowly strode up to the top of the mountain, which was when he suddenly shivered. Breath sticking in his throat, he tried to take a step back, but before he could, he simply faded out of existence. All of the surrounding guardians were shocked. Deathly silence resulted. This challenge to God had played out exactly like the legend of the first sovereign who had challenged him. Then, to the complete astonishment of the guardians, the statue opened its eyes. Simultaneously, the multitude of suns that filled the starry sky blazed with unheard-of radiance, and the moon sparkled more dazzlingly than ever. The living beings that populated the 1,080,000 worlds were shaken to the core as they then heard a warm yet ancient voice speaking to them. How careless of me! With a stir of will, let tribulation appear. In response to the words, everything in the starry sky that contained essence or magical law stirred. A new thought seemed to enter all minds, and within the vast starry sky, a new natural law came into being. It was the natural law of heavenly tribulation. Henceforth, heavenly tribulation existed, and any who challenged it were essentially challenging Xiaochun, but Xiaochun did not reject challenges, and yet, wanted to seek enlightenment and peace. In conjunction with his words, the guardians who stood watch around his statue vanished, reappearing in the worlds that they came from. In that instant, all descriptions and recollections regarding Xiaochun that existed within the various ancient records faded away. From then on, Xiaochun did not exist within the histories of any of the peoples of the starry sky. The hallowed land of the statue also disappeared, never again to be discovered by any cultivators. From that point on, the peoples of the starry sky developed on their own. People still arose who challenged the heavens, but the legends of Xiaochun, and the myths of the origin of the starry sky, were eventually forgotten. Time continued to slip by. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. Please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Chapter 1311 A will eternal. Chapter 1311 A will eternal.
The disappearance of Bai Xiaochun ushered the peoples of the starry sky into a new age. No one could see him, but he remained where he had always been, in the former location of the eternal immortal domains, his eyes closed as he sought enlightenment of essence.
Days passed.
Years passed. One day, Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes, only the second time he had done so since he began to meditate. The first time was when he created heavenly tribulation.
This time was because he had gained enlightenment of everything.
He had witnessed the rise of life.
He had created the sun and moon and all living beings.
He had observed the darkness and the light of the starry sky. He had been present as living creatures became many, and had sought enlightenment through countless tens upon tens of thousands of years.
Now, when he opened his eyes, it was possible to see a boundless calmness and purity deep therein. He was so pure that he seemed untainted by even a speck of dust.
In some ways, his eyes were like a newborn child's as he looked out at the stars.
Back when I fought the mortal renegade, I asked myself, what is essence?
I had trouble with that question for a long time, but now, I understand.
I know what essence is.
Essence has no form or shape, it's almost like it doesn't even exist, but simultaneously, it creates and contains every form and shape. Essence has no beginning or end, but simultaneously, creates and contains the beginning and end of everything. Although he only murmured the words softly, they caused all of the 1,080,000 worlds to tremble. Essence takes up no space, but simultaneously, creates and contains all space. Essence exists outside of time, but simultaneously, creates and contains all time. With these sentences having been uttered, all of the natural laws in the starry sky, as well as all the magical laws, began to resonate. Essence is noiseless and lightless, but simultaneously, creates and contains all sound and light. Essence does not exist in any one specific place, but simultaneously, creates and contains all places. As Bai Xiaochun smiled and spoke these fifth and sixth sentences, all the living beings throughout the starry sky became still and quiet. In that silence, Bai Xiaochun spoke his final two sentences.
Essence is infinitely small, but simultaneously, infinitely large. Essence is completely unique, and completely boundless.
Radiant colors suddenly appeared within the silent starry sky. Countless natural and magical laws fused, and then dispersed.
The starry sky vanished, leaving behind only a single point. It was a singularity of absolutely no length, breadth, or depth.
That singularity existed within the starry sky. It contained all magical laws, all natural laws, and a total of 1,080,000 worlds. When Bai Xiaochun saw that, he smiled. Waving his finger, he caused the singularity to transform into a line. It had no breadth or depth, and yet, was infinitely long, with no end.
I'm missing something, aren't I? After a moment of thought, he waved his finger again, and the infinitely long line suddenly became infinitely wide. Because it was infinitely long and wide, it was actually impossible to tell which direction was which. Such descriptions could only exist in one's thoughts. From a distance, it almost looked like an enormous sheet of paper, spread out through the starry sky. Bai Xiaochun looked at it for a moment, smiled again, and then waved his hand, causing it to grow infinitely deep and high. Now, it didn't look like a piece of paper, but rather, an infinitely wide, infinitely long, infinitely tall box. Still missing something. Shaking his head, Bai Xiaochun waved his finger, causing the infinitely long, wide, and tall box to ripple and distort. It seemed to age, blurring, as though the passage of time was transforming it into something illusory, into a vortex, into space. It contained everything that made up the starry sky for the past tens of thousands of years, their existences stretched out together. It contained all life forms and all living beings, from the moment they were born until they died, from the moment they existed, until they didn't exist. And everything in between. By stepping into that space, one could appear at any moment that had ever existed.
Xiaochun looked at this world made of time and space, and quietly said, "This is the same vortex that holy extermination opened with those Dao domain treasures of his. This is how the river of time and space appears." He extended his right hand, and visible within it was a golden leaf, the very same leaf that he had found in the Bloodstream sect, along with the little turtle. Way back then, he had no way to understand what that leaf was. After reaching the sovereign realm, and beginning his search for enlightenment, he had occasionally studied it, but had gained little as a result. But now, as he looked down at the leaf, everything became clear.
Interesting. No wonder I was never able to understand what this leaf was.
It is actually made of a vast number of unique leaves, all with different overlapping vein patterns.
Because the veins are transparent, they are impossible to see. But with my current divine sense, I can see them now, each and every vein. As for the information contained therein.
He looked closer, eyes glinting with curiosity, until he finally smiled again.
Well, what's this? The cultivation system of the never-ending Tao domain is divided into steps. First step, second step, third step, fourth step. The fourth step is the last. Only by practicing cultivation to that level can an almighty being see the truth about this leaf. Apparently, the Tao domain treasures that holy extermination used contained the full power of the fourth step. Xiaochun smiled. Although the leaf did not look like anything particularly unique, he could now see that it could actually act as a key that lead to the never-ending Tao domain. There is more I can do. He looked with narrowed eyes at the vortex of space and time that he had created. As he did, his eyes reflected the countless beams of light from the dimensions therein. There were too many to count, each of which contained innumerable living beings, all with their own unique destinies. However, his mere act of looking at the dimensions caused them to tremble unstably, as though they might collapse at any moment. With that, he looked away, and everything vanished. The expression of space and time that he had created vanished, and the starry sky went back to normal. It's not that I'm incapable of doing it, but rather, the starry sky can't sustain such a dramatic transformation. Based on the descriptions from the never-ending Tao domain, doesn't that imply that there's a fifth step which they haven't encountered yet? I should pay a visit to the never-ending Tao domain, and see if their starry sky can sustain such a transformation. Having made his decision, he ignored the leaf. What is the eternal? He asked himself. A moment passed, and he shook his head. How could there truly be something eternal? According to the people from the never-ending Tao domain, their fourth step is the eternal realm. But if there is something uniquely eternal, perhaps it's just one's power of imagination. He sighed. Imagination is the most powerful force there is. Essentially, imagination is will. Take, for example, the first time I saw the moonflower seeds spreading out. I remember being moved, because I was born from the very thoughts of the original arch-ancestor, from his imagination. And all of the eternal sons were born from the eternal mother in the same way. He closed his eyes, and could almost see the eternal mother letting loose a cloud of dandelion seeds, all of them containing her will, which she hoped would eventually grow into children, one of whom would bring an end to the great catastrophe. Those expressions of will became the three sovereigns, who, in the moment before their death, released their own will. One fragment of that will contained something that Xiaochun recognized as his own aura. Laughing softly, he rose to his feet. As he did, everything around him vanished, and he took a step forward. A vortex appeared, similar to the one he had created earlier. As it spun and swirled, it opened up to reveal a boundless river. The river of time and space. He stepped forward into the river, and disappeared. As he did, he spoke, causing his words to echo out into the starry sky before eventually fading away. One will to create oceans. One will to summon mulberry fields. One will to slaughter countless devils. One will to eradicate innumerable immortals. Only my will is eternal. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect,
broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 13:12, The Left Side. Chapter 13:12, The Left Side. The river of time and space existed in another dimension. The water that made it up was formed by images of time and space itself, and contained an infinitude of human lives. Within that river, it was possible to see every person who had ever existed, or would exist, from the moment they were born until they died. Xiaochun was standing on the bank of the river, waiting for something, expression calm as he looked at the river water. Before long, the sound of rippling water could be heard, and a boat appeared. As it slid through the water, Xiaochun looked over, his expression the same as ever, his gaze falling upon the boatman. He wore a wide, conical hat which obscured his face, but as he neared, he looked up, revealing ancient features to Xiaochun. He smiled. "Please step aboard, fellow Taoist." Xiaochun smiled and nodded. After he stepped onto the boat, the old boatman began to row, and the boat floated down the river of time and space. Time passed, although it was impossible to say how much. The boatman didn't say anything, and neither did Xiaochun, who simply stood quietly at the prow, looking at the water. He saw the lives of countless people, and within the rippling sound of the water, he could hear countless voices. It was all very pleasant. "We've met before," Xiaochun said. The boatman looked over. Smiling, he said, "If stepping through time and space to discuss the Tao for a moment counts as having met, then we have indeed met, fellow Taoist." 1. Xiaochun smiled. The moment he had seen this old man's face, he knew who he was. He was the owner of the precious treasure that was the hourglass. He was the master of the worldly Taoist, as well as the mortal Taoist, who eventually changed his name to Mortal Renegade. This old man had transformed himself into time itself. Continuing to row the boat, the old man said, "And why have you come here, fellow Taoist?" Continuing to stare at the water, Xiaochun quietly replied, "To pick a flower. The eternal flower." The boatman laughed. "Well, that's not going to be easy." At that point, Xiaochun made a grasping motion, causing an aphrodisiac pill to suddenly appear between his fingers. When the boatman saw that pill, his laughter gurgled to a stop, and his mouth snapped shut. The truth was that although he seemed very calm on the outside, as soon as Xiaochun had appeared, his heart had begun to pound with anxiety. It was only natural for him to recognize Xiaochun. This was the river of time and space, and the old man was an expression of time itself. He knew everything. A mere glance at Xiaochun revealed all the information about the fight with the mortal renegade, as well as everything afterward. As all of the various details had been revealed to him, he collapsed a bit inwardly, almost unable to believe everything he had seen. He could sense that Xiaochun's cultivation base had already reached an unfathomable level. In fact, the old boatman had actually never considered that someone could become this powerful. This old boatman had long since reached the fourth step of cultivation, and yet, not even he would dare to consume an aphrodisiac pill created by someone as almighty as Xiaochun. Perhaps with other pills, he might have taken a chance. But aphrodisiac pills seized good fortune from heaven and earth to become powerful to an indescribable degree. "I can't believe you're threatening me with an aphrodisiac pill," the old man thought. "If you don't want to listen to what I have to say, fine. There's no need for those things." He didn't dare to speak any of those words out loud. Bowing his head, he continued to row the boat through the river of time and space. Eventually, they reached a place filled with countless eternal flowers. Each and every one of the flowers contained images touched by time. Some of the images were dark and listless, while some were bright and colorful. The eternal flowers all had 5 petals, and were dazzlingly colorful. The fragrant aroma they emitted was delightful. As for the pistil of the flower, it featured a glowing sphere of light, within which was a closed eye. On each of the innumerable eternal flowers was a little turtle, who would scurry about, seemingly on the verge of hungrily gobbling up one of the petals. Among the multitude of eternal flowers, there were 2 that were particularly conspicuous, and immediately jumped out to Bai Xiaochun. After a moment, the boatman cleared his throat, looked at Bai Xiaochun, and said, "The river of time and space is supposed to contain things related to the trajectory of actual lives, just broken up into countless segments. But there is something unique and special about the eternal flower, something that is essentially halfway into the fifth step. It now contains countless possibilities, and thus, there are countless versions of the eternal flower. Each one represents a different destiny. Therefore, which one do you want?" "All of them." Bai Xiaochun replied, his eyes fixed on the eternal flowers. The boatman was inclined to glare at him, but then he thought of the level of Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base, and his aphrodisiac pills, and forced himself to remain calm. "I can't stop you," he said with a wry smile. "But, what would be the point of that?" Bai Xiaochun didn't respond. He knew that such an act would be somewhat meaningless, and therefore, continued to study the eternal flowers. Just as the old boatman had said, each of the eternal flowers existed at a different point in time. Some were during his spirit stream sect days, others during the bloodstream sect days. In some, he was in the wildlands, and in quite a few, the heavenspan realm had collapsed, and he was in the eternal immortal domains. Each flower represented a different point in time, and a different destiny. And he could pick any of them that he wished. The boatman didn't try to rush him, mostly because he didn't dare to. He simply looked on. Eventually, he even pulled out a jug of alcohol from somewhere and began to drink. After some more time passed, Bai Xiaochun's gaze came to be focused on the two flowers he found to be most eye-catching. One of them was on the far left side of the river, the other, on the far right. They couldn't have been more opposite. After some more thought, he sent some divine sense into the eternal flower on the left. Immediately, images sprang up in his mind. He saw a village at the foot of Mount Hood. The villagers and local elders all stood at the entrance of the village, looking at a young man. The young man had sparkling eyes and fair skin, and was dressed in a homespun robe. He wasn't very tall, and at first glance, seemed very well behaved. However, he had a huge collection of axes and cleavers tucked into his garments in various places, which seemed very out of place. As Bai Xiaochun looked at the young man, the vision he was experiencing overlapped with his own memories, and he realized that if he picked this eternal flower, he would return to the beginning of everything. "Dear elders and fellow villagers, I am on my way to learn about immortal cultivation. I shall miss all of you." The young man wore a slightly pained expression, as if he couldn't bear to part with his fellow villagers. A white-haired old man stepped out of the crowd and said, "Xiaochun, ever since your dad and mom left us, oh so long ago, you have been," he paused for a moment, "such a good kid, but..." "Don't tell me you're not interested in living forever? All you have to do is become an immortal, and then you can live forever. That's a really, really long time. Well, it's time for you to leave now. Even a baby eagle must learn to fly eventually. No matter what situations you run into out there, you have to hang in there and keep moving forward. Once you leave the village, you can't come back, because your path will always lie ahead, not behind." As other villagers offered similar exhortations, the village elder patted the young man on the shoulder and gave him a kind smile. Apparently due to all the encouragement, the young man nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. Taking one last look at his fellow villagers, he turned and walked away. The sight was so moving to the villagers that tears of excitement began to flow down their cheeks. Justice from the heavens! The weasel is finally gone. Who was it that told him they saw an immortal in the area? Whoever it was, I'm going to give you a huge reward on behalf of the village. Today is the beginning of a new era. Even as such cries began to rise up, the young man suddenly turned and trotted back into the village. Looking very determined, he cleared his throat and said, "I've made up my mind. I'm not going. I'm serious. I don't want to become an immortal." All of the villagers stared at him in shock. A few of them had pulled out drums or gongs, but were now so taken aback that they dropped them onto the ground with a clattering bang. Bai Xiaochun watched the scene play out, a smile on his face. Eventually, the vision faded away, and he was once again looking at the eternal flower on the left.
The starting point. 1. Bai Xiaochun originally met this boatman in chapter 439.
If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Chapter 1313, An Oil Lamp and an Ancient Temple. Chapter 1313, An Oil Lamp and an Ancient Temple.
The old boatman took a sip of alcohol and then said, "Going back to the beginning would be an excellent choice.
Take your memories with you, and relive your life.
Not only would you not have to worry about that possessed rebel of an apprentice of mine, but you could also rectify many of your regrets.
People always have regrets, mostly decisions made from youth or inexperience.
One always has pain and loss, but by reliving life, you could really make things as perfect as they could be."
Definitely a good choice, that one.
The old man sighed, his eyes flickering with reminiscence. It seemed that even he, who had become time itself, still had memories that caused him to sigh.
Bai Xiaochun didn't say anything in response.
He stood there at the prow of the boat, seemingly lost in thought. Perhaps he was weighing the old boatman's words, and thinking back to everything that had happened in his life.
Eventually, the boatman finished drinking his jug of alcohol. At that point, Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes.
Although he didn't speak, there was a glint deep in his eyes that no observer would ever be able to detect. Turning his head, he looked at the flower on the right. As soon as he did, images floated up in his mind, until they occupied the entirety of his sea of consciousness. This time, he was not observing the scene as if from an outside perspective. It was as if he had actually gone back in time, and not to the beginning of the story. The starry sky was dark, but at the same time, filled with starlight. That light came from the ruined worlds that Bai Xiaochun and the mortal renegade had fought over. This was the very moment in time that holy extermination had died. This time, he failed in his attempt to open the river of time and space. Before the rumbling vortex could completely form, the essence of the eternal, in the form of that mysterious energy, completely erased him out of existence. The only thing that remained was his voice, filled with infinite regret.
In the very end, I still failed.
As he was erased, the three great Tao domain treasures that had created the vortex fell down, and the river faded away.
The vortex also disappeared.
Although the eternal immortal domains were cracked and damaged to the point where they were about to fall to pieces, they still existed. Everyone was still alive, including Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo, Ho Xiaomei, and Gongsun Wan'er. The moment of crisis had passed. The aura of the Eternal Mother gradually began to spread, and the eternal immortal domains began to recover.
As for Bai Xiaochun, he looked just like he had back in those days.
He had used so much life force that he was incomparably weak, but he was still smiling as he closed his eyes and began to drop down into the eternal immortal domains. As he did, a soft light from the Eternal Mother reached out to embrace him, and gently carried him down into Archemperor's city. Even as he lost consciousness, he could hear the voices of his friends, his family, and his children.
All of them were cheering.
He also heard the angry cry of the little turtle.
"I hate you, Bai Xiaochun."
But then the voices faded away, and time began to pass. Years later, he awoke. The eternal immortal domains was still the only spot where life existed. However, instead of the black void which had surrounded it in the past, there were now a multitude of stars. They were the ruins that Bai Xiaochun had brought light to, and given enough time, that light and life force would bring new life. Now that the catastrophe of the mortal renegade had passed, life became ordinary again in the eternal immortal domains. The 5 domains were all repaired, and the eternal sea was as majestic as ever. Vegetation and other forms of life flourished on the highest mountains and in the vastest of the plains. The Saint Emperor dynasty still existed.
And although the Vile Emperor dynasty didn't have a Vile Emperor anymore, Bai Xiaochun allowed the empire to survive.
The eternal immortal domains continued to have 3 major powers. War was a thing of the past. Without the threat of the mortal renegade, and the corrosive spirit he brought with him, the Eternal Mother recovered. Whereas the Saint Emperor had once been doomed to remain as a half-sovereign, he now had hope for reaching a higher level.
The only person to leave the eternally mortal domains was Song Quebec. He took the treasured fan to the ruins of the immortal world, where he waited for them to recover, and for life to return. Once the chi flow of the world was restored, he would have his path to the sovereign realm. Dabeo became the new archemperor. Although the Grand Heaven Master was very old, he still loved the exercise of power, and therefore, he and the giant Ghost King both assisted Dabeo. Li Qingho wasn't interested in the affairs of the world anymore. He and Patriarch Spirit Stream lived out in the lush mountains, far away from the affairs of the dynasty. Despite that, not a person existed in the eternal immortal domains who would ever dare to refuse a request from them. The Eternal Mother took note of this, and gave Li Qingho a blessing of abundant life force. Big Fatty Zhang, Master God Diviner, and Su Baokai eventually became celestials, and lived happy lives. Big Fatty Zhang found a Taoist partner, as did Su Baokai. There was little need to mention Bruiser. He was soon just as impressive as he had been back in the river-defying sect, and sired countless offspring. Bai Xiaochun's children all tread their own paths. Xiao got married, to a rather shy but, at the same time, very earnest cultivator. They lived a very happy life. Most frustrating of all to Bai Xiaochun was Xiaobao. He had inherited just about every aspect of Bai Xiaochun's personality, and acted just like he would. In fact, the little turtle seemed to find a kindred spirit in him, and abandoned Bai Xiaochun to spend time with Xiaobao. The little turtle has definitely led my son astray, Bai Xiaochun thought, sighing. Worst of all was that Xiaobao loved to concoct medicine, and had inherited his father's talents in that regard. He had long since mastered the aphrodisiac pill and the fantasy pill, and had even improved on them. And he had gone on to create many new pills, much to Bai Xiaochun's consternation. In addition to spending time with his master, Bai Hao had begun to search for his own path to becoming a sovereign. At the same time, he had been tasked with watching over Xiaobao, which involved putting out a lot of fires caused by the disaster duo of Xiaobao and the little turtle. However, now that everything had settled down, Bai Xiaochun had come to the conclusion that Bai Hao needed to get married and settle down. Unfortunately, Bai Hao wasn't interested in that, and always used the excuse of having to watch over Xiaobao and the little turtle to push the matter off into the future. After this happened several times, Bai Xiaochun had a very serious and important meeting with Xiaobao, who was his true successor, to give him the responsibility of making sure Bai Hao fell in love and got married. Off to the side, the little turtle listened, and his eyes began to sparkle as he realized that he had found a new goal in life. Peace and serenity reigned. Song Junwan, Ho Xiaomei, Zhou Zimo, and Gongsun Wan are kept Bai Xiaochun very happy. In the end, the cultivation world had become exactly like he had always imagined it could be, free from fighting and killing. And yet, there was still one last thing he regretted. On one particular day, Bai Xiaochun was standing in a courtyard on a mountain some distance away from Archemperor City, bathed by the glow of the setting sun. Turning his head, he looked off in a certain direction. That should be the place, he murmured. He took a step forward, and vanished. When he reappeared, he was in one of the distant border regions of the Vile Emperor dynasty. There, at the edge of a remote village, was a temple. It was a small temple, with 2 maple trees flanking the entrance, their leaves as red as fire. As the leaves slowly dropped from the trees and drifted to the ground, they made a particularly entrancing scene. It was evening here too, and the fiery red evening cast light onto the tiles and bricks of the temple, making it look like the prayer garment of a monk. It was very peaceful, and for a long moment, Bai Xiaochun simply stood there in front of the temple with his eyes closed, listening to the sound of scriptures being sung within the temple. The singer was a woman, her voice soft and filled with piety. As soon as he heard that voice, he thought back to memories of the past. As he stood there, he seemed to become one with the crimson evening sunlight. Time slowed as an autumn wind suddenly kicked up, lifting his hair and causing rustling sounds to rise up as the fallen leaves swirled into motion.
However, it almost seemed like the leaves and the wind understood that scriptures were being sung in the temple, and did not compete with the woman who was singing them. The scene was perfect. Later, Xiaochun opened his eyes, sighed, and walked toward the temple. Reaching out, he placed his hand on the red-lacquered door of the temple, then pushed it open. Inside, he saw a statue of the Eternal Mother, illuminated by an oil lamp. In front of the statue was a woman, on her knees, head bowed, singing to the statue. She wore simple, homespun garments, and had long black hair that flowed down her shoulders. She almost seemed to be part of the temple around her. Xiaochun stood there quietly, listening to her sing. It was a song about a lifetime devoted to religion, a lifetime spent alone in an ancient temple, with only an oil lamp for company. A moment passed, and the woman suddenly seemed to realize that she wasn't alone. But she didn't look over her shoulder. She shivered, and a tear ran down her cheek, landing on the ground in front of the oil lamp, splashing out into the shape of a flower. A flower filled with emotion and memory. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 13-14, His Choice. Chapter 13-14, His Choice. Everything by Xiaochun had just seen faded away, becoming an eternal memory. He opened his eyes, to find himself still standing at the prow of the boat in the river of time and space. After a moment, he looked away from the eternal flower on the right. The old boatman took out another jug of alcohol, took a sip, and then looked at Xiaochun. That flower really suits you. It's not going back to the beginning, but neither is it the true ending. Xiaochun didn't say anything, and it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. He looked at the flower on the left, and then the flower on the right, and finally, closed his eyes again. Why don't you take that flower on the right? It seems wonderful to me. Although, both of them are actually acceptable. Trying to pick between the two seems like a very difficult choice. The old man sighed. Truthfully, not even he would have an easy time making this choice. One of them features a set conclusion. Although it would conform to your desires, everything is already set. The other features endless possibilities, and a future brimming with options. Maybe you could make things more perfect. Maybe you could get rid of all your doubts, and make your future exactly the way you want it. The old man shook his head. How will you pick? Would you like to have a drink while you consider? With that, he held out his jug of alcohol. There's no need. Xiaochun said. Opening his eyes, he looked out at the two flowers. Smiling, he reached out. The end. 13-14, One Life, One Lifetime. A will eternal. In Chinese, the number 1314 rhymes with the characters that mean one life, one lifetime, or essentially one's whole life. It's a very sentimental and somewhat romantic number. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 13-15, End, Epilogue. Epilogue. Years passed. Ages. The eternal spirit world glittered with bright light, and its 1,080,000 worlds glowed radiantly. Generations of powerful experts came and went. Archeans. Sovereigns. As the saying goes, after the rain, the spring bamboo blossoms. These new experts became like shining stars within the eras in which they lived. The eternal immortal domains became the brightest star among all the other stars. Eventually, Xiaochun left the eternal immortal domains, taking his friends and family with him. Afterward, his story became a legend, and then a myth. Even years later, people would still talk about the stories, which to some extent was the ultimate explanation of the history of the eternal immortal domains. No one knew where Xiaochun went. All they could do was study the most ancient records in the Archemperor dynasty, where they found only the vaguest of clues. Apparently, whoever left the records behind wanted people to know that Bai Xiaochun, along with his friends and family, had gone to some unknown location, where they would spend their days in complete happiness. People accepted this version of events, and it soon came to be official history in the eternal spirit world. With every generation that came and went, cultivators would attempt to search for Bai Xiaochun, in the hopes of personally meeting the most powerful person to ever exist.
And yet, none of them ever succeeded.
Outside of the eternal spirit world was a vast starry sky filled with endless mist that made it difficult to see very far in any direction. And yet, it was not possible to see someone flying through that mist at top speed, an emotional expression on his face.
I did it! I finally escaped. He looked like a young man, fair and pure, dressed in a white robe.
As for the expression on his face, it was one of pure delight, like a caged bird that had just been freed.
Those women are too much. I'm the honest one. The sincere one. What gives them the right to bully me? He sighed.
From the gleam in his eyes, it could be seen that although he wasn't any sort of villain, he was by no means the honest type.
Of course, this young man was none other than Bai Xiaochun.
In the ancient records it said that he took his family and friends to some unknown location to live in happiness.
Although that was true, after enough time passed, Bai Xiaochun simply couldn't take it any longer. That was just his personality. It was exacerbated by the fact that Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo, Ho Xiaomei and Gong Sunwaner were very strict with him. It eventually reached the point where he bristled with anger. They won't let any other women even talk to me. They don't let me go out alone, and they even have the audacity to say that I cause disasters wherever I go. They're worried that I'll destroy our home? I could deal with that, but then they actually forbid me from concocting medicine. What kind of a person do they think I am? Can't talk to other women? Fine. Can't go out and have fun? Fine. Can't concoct medicine? Whatever. The final straw is their bickering. Even after years of being married, no matter how much I console them, no matter how reasonable I am, we're always fighting. The last fight lasted 1,000 years. What was most maddening was that when he discussed something important with his Taoist partners, they would all look at him, and wait to see which of them he looked back at. I finally made a clean escape. They're all busy getting ready for New Year's, so at least I can get out and stretch my legs. And thus, he flew along, determined to finally have some fun. Sighing, he proceeded along, passing through vast stretches of space with each movement. As for his final destination, he had already made his decision. He would go to the home of the little turtle, the never-ending Dao domain. Upon arriving, and just before entering, his expression flickered as he noticed something floating through the vast mist. That's the aura of the fourth step. No, wait. That's the aura of the fifth step. Blinking, he reached out into the mist, causing a blur of light to fly toward his hand. It was a bottle. Or more precisely, a message in a bottle. This bottle had floated for who knew how long through the misty, starry sky, until Bai Xiaochun happened across it. How amusing, he thought, blinking a few times. After looking at the bottle for a moment, he opened it and took out the contents, which consisted of a single strip of paper. Curious, he opened the paper and immediately laughed. Who wrote this? He wanted to get rich? However, even as he chuckled, his expression flickered, as streams of karma rose up from the paper, seemingly intent on connecting to Bai Xiaochun. Eyes widening, he quickly performed an incantation gesture with his left hand to sever the karma. What a villain! Who is this guy? His Tao contains karma? And whoever touches this paper will create a promissory note to him? They'll owe him money through karma? He looked at the paper for a moment, then snorted coldly. He's so obsessed with money he's gone crazy. Another moment passed, and he waved his hand, causing a new line of text to appear on the other side of the piece of paper. What's so good about being rich? Living forever is the most important thing. I want to live forever. With that, he prepared to throw the bottle back out again.
But then he hesitated, pulled the paper back out, and added another line. Never get more than one Taoist partner. Feeling very satisfied, he hoped that anyone who found the bottle in the future would listen to his advice, which was essentially the accumulation of all his life experience. Flicking his sleeve, he sent the bottle flying out into the mist, and then headed toward the never-ending Tao domain. If I ever meet that crazy bastard, I'll definitely talk some sense into him. I can't believe he dared to try to make me owe him money. Maybe I should give him a fantasy pill. Or an aphrodisiac pill. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.